The first pattern, called pattern 0, is what I call the confused fact finder. I call this pattern 0 because people who are operating at this level of thinking really don't have any of what we typically call critical thinking or judgment skills. These are people who are looking for only a single correct answer. For example, in a classroom, if you ask these students to answer a question that involves analysis or judgment of some kind, they want to repeat information out of a textbook or out of their classroom notes. Instead of using their own judgment, they repeat things that they have memorized or that they believe experts have said. Their approach when you give them a task that requires judgment is just plain wrong. They are looking for one answer instead of realizing that there may be more than one possible answer. I often find in a homework assignment or an exam that these students quote inappropriately from a textbook. Let me give you an example of what that might look like. Suppose I am teaching a class on current economic events. Of course, here in the United States, we have a big controversy about health care and what many people refer to as Obamacare. Suppose I were to ask students in an exam to discuss the pros and cons of Obamacare. The student who is operating as a confused fact finder doesn't understand what I mean by pros and cons. They believe there is only one answer. Obamacare is either good or bad. If I have given students some resources, such an article with a table listing pros and cons, these students might memorize the list and recite it on an exam, but they don't actually understand what pros and cons are. Typically, what I will see instead of pros and cons are definitions, or they will recite a single expert's claims. In other words, these students don't understand my question. These students also tend to contradict themselves. Students operating as a confused fact finder might make a statement and then in the next sentence turn around and contradict what they just said. These students don't have logical reasoning skills. They don't know how to put an argument together in a logical fashion. This is one of their key weaknesses. Because of these weaknesses, many professors think that these students don't know how to read carefully. I don't believe that's the real issue. As I mentioned earlier, if I ask these students to provide pros and cons, they don't understand what pros and cons are. So when they respond to my question by instead giving me definition, I don't recognize their pattern of thinking. I might incorrectly assume that, gosh, they don't know how to read. The problem isn't their reading. The problem is their underlying assumptions. They believe that answers come from an expert and that only experts have the answers. At the end of a classroom discussion about some matter that requires judgment, I often have these students raise their hand and ask, "But what was the answer?" And they are waiting for me, the expert in the classroom, to tell them what the only answer is. They don't realize that what we are trying to do is explore issues and look at different viewpoints and try to understand more fully something that is open-ended. Now, the bad news is that research indicates that about half of first-year undergraduates in the United States are operating as confused fact-finders. And I have found that even in master's level courses, it isn't uncommon to have as many as 10 or 20% of the students thinking this way. This is a picture that I hope will help you visualize this pattern. I often think of the confused fact finder as the toddler who's climbing up on a piece of furniture and risks falling down. The problem is that they approach problems in a very naive way. They might explore a bit, trying to learn something, but their attempts are often futile. Their performance tends to be fairly low in our eyes. Some of you are in the higher education world and some are in the workplace settings. I would like you to think about students in a course you teach or a group of people you work with, and I would like you to reflect and think about whether some of those people seem to be operating as confused fact finders, and if so, about what proportion. I will now post a polling question so that you can give me a sense of whether there are a lot of confused fact finders among your students or the people you work with. I'm now showing you the results of the poll. The data show that about 3/4 of you think that 10 to 40% of your target population operate as confused fact finders, and a few of you think that the percent is lower or higher than that. What you have told me is very consistent with the research in higher education. I will come back later in the webinar and show you some data after we've learned about the other 4 patterns of thinking. What I want to do now is share with you the transition. We started with pattern 0, but the question is, how do you encourage people to transition beyond this level? I will briefly talk about what I call step 1 skills. This is the first level of skills that people need to develop so that they can move past confused fact finder thinking. The first skill, and probably the most important, is to challenge these students' underlying assumptions. These students believe that there's a single correct answer to everything. We need to convince them that this belief is simply not true for many problems. And that means confronting them with conflicting opinions and evidence that we don't know something. In classes where I have a lot of students operating at this stage, I introduce the idea of uncertainties with every single topic in the course. Fortunately, a heavy focus on uncertainties doesn't waste the time of students operating at the higher cognitive stages. What happens is that confused fact finders are learning about uncertainties for the first time, while students at the higher stages are learning more about uncertainties. In other words, this teaching approach isn't bad for other students. So I try to take every topic and hold a discussion about why we don't know things. And uncertainties in turn lead to this notion that if we don't have single correct answers, then it's okay for different people to have different opinions. Until students accept this idea of uncertainty, they don't believe that multiple perspectives are valid. When they learn that different people hold different opinions, their initial reaction is that one opinion must be right, while the other's wrong. So this idea of uncertainties opens the door to new possibilities. Oh my goodness, nobody knows for sure. And because nobody knows for sure, then different people can hold different opinions. And that, in turn, leads to the idea that if I'm going to have my own opinion on this topic, then I will need to provide some logical reasons or arguments to support it. So this is the transition from confused fact finder to what I call pattern 1, the bias jumper.